Hello, everyone, and welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Carolyn Ducey. I am the Artist B. James Curator of Collections here at the International Quilt Museum located in Nebraska, in Lincoln, and it's so lovely to see everyone coming in from around the world. We're so delighted to have you here today. The International Quilt Museum proudly stewards and exhibits the world's largest collection of quilts that span 5 centuries and over 65 countries. In fact, that is our mission and our passion, to build a global collection and audience that celebrates the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. If this is your passion too, and you aren't already a member, we would love to have you join us. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize and thank the organizations that partner with the International Quilt Museum to bring you textile talks each week: the Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. We're honored to bring you free and inspiring programming with the help of our sponsors, and we couldn't do it without their generosity and the generosity of viewers like you. Just a couple things before we get started today. Please use the Q&A for questions in the chat box to say hello and greet and comment on the program. If you prefer not to see those notifications, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. The live captions make Textile Talks accessible to a wider audience. However, if you prefer not to view the captions, you should be able to turn those off as well. Don't forget, next week, June 19th, we will have a wonderful program presented by the Quilt Alliance, Juneteenth Reflections, which is going to be a conversation with a number of artists led by Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi. You don't want to miss that program. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this wonderful program we have scheduled. We are going to be talking about the power of political messaging in activist quilts. And here's Teri. Teri, thank you so much for joining us. Let me give your bio real quick for everyone. Dr. Teri Walker is Professor of Political Science at Elmhurst University in Illinois. She teaches courses in American government and politics, law, and public policy with an emphasis on environmental policy. Her books include The Introduction to Politics Anthology, Knowledge, Power, and Action, published in 2022, and Today's Environmental Issues, Democrats and Republicans, published in 2018. Teri, we are so lucky to have you here. Teri was a recipient of an International Quilt Museum Fellowship to do research on activist quilts. So we've had an opportunity to work with you and have you here in the museum looking at quilts. It's been great. So before we launch into your official PowerPoint program, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you kind of came to this project?
Hey, sure. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Carolyn told you I teach political science, but I am also a quilter. And so this project came about for my sabbatical project. And I wanted to study political communication and behavior and First Amendment rights in quilts. Because I love both the quilts and I love First Amendment rights and political communication and behavior. So I started looking at what I could do for a project about political quilts. Okay, I need to talk a little bit louder. Quilted messages represent a unique dimension of political power, and it's something that political scientists ignore. It's not really talked about in our realm, and so I wanted to acknowledge the role of quilts in the political world, as well as the impact of activist quilts, both on themselves and viewers of political quilts. And I think by uncovering the power of activist quilts, it's important to understanding political and social justice issues, participation, activism, First Amendment rights, and so that's where this comes about.
Well, it's really fascinating to be working with you because you are outside of the academic quilt world. And so what you're looking at is coming from that political science viewpoint. And I think you've brought up some really fascinating things for us today. So why don't we go ahead then and open up your, share your screen, and let's let you go ahead and present your information and maybe give a little bit of a background about how the actual research, the whole project worked as you go through this. So.
Sure. Okay, just give me 1 second here.
I am going to go ahead and mute myself and turn off my video. So Teri, I'll just let you take it over from here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are we seeing the full screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Just a little bit about my methodology, as Carolyn talked about. I did, when this project first started, which was a couple years ago, I did join quilt societies and organizations and museums and guilds and stuff like that. And I looked at databases from the International Quilt Museum and the Modern Quilt Guild, but they don't categorize political quilts as political. And so I had to kind of create a list of words to search for political quilts. So I would put in things like liberal, conservative. I would put in women's rights, equality, freedom. So I created a whole list of words to try and find political quilts and political quilters, going through quilters' websites and blogs and stuff like that. And then eventually I narrowed that focus to 21st century quilts and quilts made by women only in the United States. So this is not international. Eventually I found like 80 quilts and looked at them. And then I did interviews with 10 activist quilters. And so just really quick, just research questions that I talked about or asked was, what political issues are depicted in quilts today? Why do women choose to create activist quilts? What's the impact, right, of the visual and tactile art medium on the personal and the collective? So how does it impact the quilter and how does it impact others? And then what power actually lies within these messages? And so that's kind of, the methodology that I have. So let's go ahead and start the presentation. This is a quilt, and I will talk about it later, but I picked this quilt by Jamie Fingal because it has a lot of political issues in it. So let me go ahead and advance. Okay, I love this quilt by Margaret Mead just because it really speaks to quilters, I think. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. So I took this picture from a long time ago because politics and quilts have been married for a very long time. So we can make a difference. All right. So this project is about power. And I teach a lot about power in all of my classes. But in the poli-sci world, we have different types of power. So hard power is what you might think. It's that aggressive form of behavior, military invasions, economic sanctions. That's not what we're talking about here. But we also have the notion of soft power, which, you're trying to persuade someone to do something or change their mind. Oftentimes, we even use soft power in the United States as films and television shows that are seen throughout the world. So that's actually another example of soft power. For purposes of this study, I define notions of soft power as the ability to influence elected officials vote on a policy. This is where the research first started. And the ability to change a policy, adopt a new policy, or the last concept is maybe just to influence anybody's opinion or public opinion on a political or social issue. So you'll see the first couple ones is really about elected officials, right? And that was kind of my question. Are these quilts impacting elected officials' votes? Okay, I have to add this transformative power, and this concept came into place after I started talking to quilters. Transformative power in the political science world is about the integration of candidates and governances in external and internal or transforming economies. But for this research, transformative power is about the self and the collective. So you'll see I say within, with, to, and for. What that basically means is that these quilts have the ability to cause constructive individual change, so yourself within yourself, but it also expands to others, right? Expanding somebody's awareness of a political issue. So that's working with people. The ability to speak and act, that's working like the power to act or the power to speak. And that's not only for the quilter, but giving people another outlet, right, to be civically engaged, right? And then the last one is you're working for, you're trying to influence or change actions, policies, beliefs, conduct, or behavior of somebody else. Okay, so the one thing I want to bring to the table here from the poli-sci world is your civil liberty, which is your First Amendment rights. And I put this up on the screen. I'm sure people are familiar with it. But if you think about what political quilts are doing, we're really thinking about the freedom of free speech or free expression, but also the very last part of the First Amendment is about the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. Because a lot of times quilts, political quilts they're making a statement, right? It could be for or against something, they could be patriotic. The quilts that are mostly in here are making a statement, right? They're telling a story. Okay, so I have a little bit of homework for you while you're watching the presentation. There's 5 questions that I just want you to contemplate. You can put them in the chat. You don't have to do anything. You can just think about it. You can write them down, not write them down. But as you look at each quilt, how do you feel when you first see the quilt? Like, what's your immediate reaction? Right? And is the message overt or subtle? Because oftentimes there are and you'll see them throughout the presentation, very overt, you know exactly what they're talking about, but other times they're subtle. You might have to read the title or the artist's statement to understand what the political issue is in the quilt. Others, it'll hit you in the face. So the third question is, what's the message of this quilt? Do you understand it, right? And then we look at, like, how does the color, or are they using words? Does the patterning, is the quilting affecting the delivery of the message, and if so, how? And then the last one is really about the power of the quilt. Like, will the quilt ask you, will you change your behavior? Will you think differently about this political issue just from viewing the political quilt, right? Okay, let's see some quilts, right? We all want to see some pictures. I divided them into political issues. I ended up looking at various political issues. Most of them are civil rights and environmental concerns. And so we'll just go ahead and move. Okay, so here is Jamie Finkel's quilt. So it highlights obviously multiple concerns. You can see the words. So did the colors attract you? Look at the words. I even like the font that is used in this. But if you look at what the words are saying, the words allude to patriotism, it alludes to democracy, it alludes to morals and values and First Amendment rights. You'll see it says "we the people," which is the preamble, right, to the US Constitution. So that part is in there. Equality, stand up. But if you take a look at this, you might think, okay, this quilt is really a call to action. And we will talk about the intent and goals of political quilts, but just think about those questions I asked you to look at. How do you feel when you see this quilt? Is the message clear, right? Will it entice you to resist? There's environmental issues in here. Will it entice you to, stand up? So all of these words are in there. And so I think it's really interesting quilt to start off with, because it's really all encompassing. Okay, the next quilt is tagged. This quilt came about in response to Patricia Kennedy Zaffreed learning about the Japanese internment during World War II. She had not learned about it prior, and she came across these photos, I think, in the Library of Congress. And she began to think about, gosh, I didn't know about this story. I need to tell this story. This is definitely a political quilt. You might have to figure out what it is. The tags are actually the tags that were put on to all of this, the women and children, because her focus was mothers and children, and her question to herself, right? So her motivation is, how dangerous can they be, right? And so this was based on the executive order from FDR that interned Japanese Americans into internment camps. There's a Supreme Court case about it, Korematsu versus United States. And the court had ruled that they could do this, that they did not extend beyond their war powers, and it was for the safety of the country. So it was upheld in court. Okay, here's some other quilts. These are quilted reactions to the United States when they voted in 2017 to require Senator Elizabeth Warren to stop speaking during the confirmation of Senator Jeff Sessions. And there's two, you can see they're the same message. Even though she was warned and toxic masculinity must end, it still says, nevertheless, she persisted. Because Mitch McConnell had said, we warned Elizabeth, she wouldn't stop talking, she broke a rule, and nevertheless, she persisted. And so there's two different versions, right? So when you think about what motivates people or how they explain the political issue. It's two very different ones, right? So you've got the American flag with just nevertheless she persisted, and then you have Melanie Testa's where same phrase, nevertheless she persisted. She also included a wording from a conversation or an interview with Trump, where she has put grab them by the pussy. So that's another aspect, right, of toxic masculinity must end, or that reaction to it. So really, when you think about this, what motivates people? Okay, we also have the Women's March and women's rights. And when we think about motivation, right, Luana Rubin stated, and I think this is really important to note, that every activist quilt has a different story. For her, there's a flashpoint. Something happens, captures her attention, so she begins to research and design and create a political statement, right? And so when you think about the motivation, it's sometimes in reaction to political events or social justices that are witnessed by people, right? It's a commitment to political and community action. Some people have a sense of responsibility that they need to speak out, but they can't say it out loud, so they put it in a quilt. Right? It is a form of political communication and behavior. It's about, maybe hoping people think differently about an issue, right? Sometimes it's just about, kind of craving a connection with people. The Resist quilt is like over 9,000 tiny squares. You can see the word, it's pretty out there, right? It's pretty overt. And then Darcy Reeves, she wore this quilt. I love this picture of her where she's wearing the quilt to a march out in, I want to say California, where she created this quilt and marched the streets with it. So I want to just read something really quick from Darcy. Wearing the quilt during the march was amazing. As I walked, I gained strength. I felt the strength of women and men and children and families that we were marching with. After feeling so powerless after the election, it marked a change in my attitude that we must keep fighting and stay strong. And there are millions of people that agree with me. Stay loud. So this was after the election of President Trump. These quilts are still political, but they're celebrating and honoring women. And I know you can't see a lot of the words in Kim Soper's quilt, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That was created for the celebration of the International Women's Day in 2018. And she put out a global call for women to stitch a word of empowerment, right? And so there's 196 words. They came from across the United States and actually the entire world because it was a global call. But 31 states are represented in this quilt and 8 different countries. But I'll give you some examples of this in the words: powerful, strong, opinionated, rebel, voter, passionate, steadfast, persistent, enough. So it's a really a fascinating quilt about a political statement about the status of women, right? And the empowerment of women. Luana Rubin's Women's Rights Are Human Rights, right? Is again a different kind of quilt about the celebration of women. So this quilt is a tribute to the iconic statement made by Hillary Clinton at the 1995 United Nations Fourth World Conference about women in Beijing. If there's one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that women's rights are human rights once and for all. So Luana took that phrase, right, and quilted it. And you can see that Hillary is in her iconic pink suit. And the phrase, women's rights are human rights, was translated into 14 languages, representing all the languages that were at that conference. And this quilt hung in the Clinton Presidential Center next to Hillary's iconic pink suit. So again, a political quilt, but more of a celebration of women, right? Gun violence is another one of those political quilts. So if you take a look at the two that I've got here, they are different, but they are still addressing gun violence. Uvalde, Texas. I'm going to read the artist statement rather quickly. In art, negative space is the empty space around a subject. It can be most evident when the space around the subject forms the relevant shape, so you can see the outline of the gun. Here are the names of 19 children and 2 teachers who died at the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Create an outline of the DDM-4 rifle that was used in the mass shooting. The negative space cuts off each name, just as the gun was used to prematurely cut off each life. Such a large deadly weapon is incongruous with the school setting, which is suggested by the lined notebook paper hand. The background is lined notebook, if you notice that, and a pink eraser board and the elementary style of handwriting. The number of holes is also addressing gun violence. The wording was spotted by Lorraine Woodruff Long in a march that she attended, a March for Our Lives rally. And so she saw that on a poster or a sign, and then she recreated it and used black denim, right? Recycled black denim, and put the holes in there to deliver the message about gun violence in the United States. So as we're thinking about these quilts, like as you first see them, you're thinking about, how do you feel about this? I'm sure people are familiar with all of the topics that I've looked at, but be thinking about the power of these quilts. Okay, women's health, abortion. So here are two very different takes on abortion. My body, my rules is pretty plain to see. My body, my choice, my pussy, my rules, my body, my right. An elegant kind of figure, right? That is a political statement about women's health and abortion. Kathy Naida, on the other hand, has she typically uses women's bodies, right, to talk about issues and stuff. So you'll see here, it's much more detailed, right? And so you'll notice that the women's bodies and the internal parts are there, and they're pushing a back against the gray bubble of men that want to limit that that right. So as you look at those, right, they're on the same issue, but they are definitely very different. Okay, this quilt is also about abortion. Your mother, your daughter, your sister, your grandmother, you. This is her artist statement. After the leak of the draft Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, I felt the need to work through my anger and frustration, knowing that a fundamental human right to essential health care was soon to be lost by millions of women. So you've got several different quilts that are still talking about the political issue of abortion and women's health, but in very different ways, right? And so as you look at that, what speaks to you, right? Does it make you want to do something? And then, of course, in Dobbs versus Jackson in 2022, the Supreme Court did. This was when the leak happened, but they did overrule Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And so those are some of those abortion kind of quilts. Okay, this one is Decision 2020. This is about the Supreme Court, gay marriage in the Supreme Court. It was this quilt is a celebration of the Bostock versus Clayton County, which the Supreme Court ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and or transgender status. So she put in the colors, right, for what we know as gay pride. The justices who voted for that, she left, so it's a 6-3 decision, right, on June 15, 2020. Notice that she left out the dissenters, which was Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh. They're not even given space in her quilt, which I think is a secondary kind of political statement in this quilt. Okay, I know you probably can't see all of this. This is the I do. As I move into some of the other quilts, I do want to talk about what these activist quilts are doing. They're drawing attention to social injustices, political questions, questions of what's right and what's wrong. They also are trying to increase empathy towards whatever issue they're portraying in their quilt. They're allowing their voices to be heard. They are used oftentimes for a tool of resistance, though I did mention they can be used for patriotism and supportive kinds of things as well. It's a way for these quilters to participate in political life, maybe in a gentler way than being out on the street and protesting and marching. So this is a political behavior, a political way to be civically engaged. And sometimes they're used as backdrops, right, in protests and stuff. So this is an interesting quilt, and it's sarcasm, right? If you could read it all, there's words, there's questions, there's political and economic events that she has, statistics about marriage, and this is about gay marriage. the play on the word sanctity, and I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but the word sanctity has money symbols in it, and in the response to guests. So they're playing on, I don't want gay marriage ruining the sanctity of my marriage. But then when you look at, oh, well, me too, I guess, there's money symbols, which I think is another kind of political statement in itself, if you take a look at the images. The questions throughout the quilt, the responses, right, to the moral majority, the state court decision allowing gay marriage, allows the viewer of these quilts to really read these questions and then ask themselves, what has a greater negative impact on society? Is it gay marriage, or is it national debt? Is it Halliburton, right? What really comes into play here? What's more important? What causes that negativity in our society? Okay, American Dream or not. These are two quilts talking about the American Dream. Good Luck is about unfair housing practices. It highlights redlining, segregation, and unfair housing. The white picket fence is used to represent the American dream of owning a home, right? And the quilting design mimics a chain link fence to keep somebody out. So it's a reflection on how some Americans are prevented from achieving that dream. And it really is highlighting discriminatory housing practices, whether it's not being able to get a loan or credit or house insurance because they're deemed to be a financial risk. On the flip side here, still about the American dream, it's called Still Learning. So Lyric Montgomery Kennard, she's got a very long artist statement. I'm only going to read a little bit of it. From its inception, the privilege of citizenship in the United States has been denied to group after group based on race and religion. Chinese immigrants were not allowed citizenship until 1943. People have been turned away who have sought refuge and opportunity. Vilifying Muslims. As we as citizens choose to better live in the highest of our American values, that all men are created equal. So if you take a look at that red flag, right, and all of the images of the people that have been denied the American dream. And then I think it's interesting the use of the red threads, which kind of looks like rips in the flag and maybe some bloodshed, I don't know. But it is definitely political statements based on the American dream. Okay, we have Carolyn Maslumi's flag series, Please Don't Shoot. The American flag, right, its stars are replaced with figures of Black men with targets on their chests and their hands raised. The names are in the red stripes of Black people who have been killed by police. The alternate stripes are Black people packed into the slave ship, and the slave ship, is the image of the Brooks, the infamous Liverpool cargo ship that used to transfer slaves. So again, another political statement based on Black Lives Matter and police brutality. We're kind of switching gears a little bit. So before we switch to environmental issues, I just want to say that the intent and the goal of quilters. So I talked about it a little bit, but a lot of people talk about education, that the intent or the goal of their quilt is to educate people or to start a political discussion, so political discourse. Maybe it's spreading awareness, right? Empowering people to speak up, to do something. Sometimes the goal is to build a community, right, for like-minded people. Political quilts can certainly cause controversy, especially if you don't agree with the message, but it is a First Amendment right. That's the poli-sci part of me coming out. Politics is all about arguing, and listening to other people's opinions and why they feel the way they do. And so the intent of the goal here, right, might be to maybe change somebody's mind or get them to think about something differently. So it's interesting because I'm going to quote Luana Rubin again, and this is based on, how some people feel about political issues, and maybe they feel like they're alone. So Luana says, if you feel alone watching the news, there are millions of other people feeling just like you. We have to find our way to each other. So many people think they don't have a voice. What would happen if we say our voice doesn't count? But change happens when people realize their voice does count. Okay, so if you think about that, right, this is again political communication behavior. So let's take a look at these two quilts by Lorraine. You're Getting Warmer is about rising global temperatures. It illustrates the global change in temperature every year. between 1850 and 2022. Each vertical line is a year reflecting temperature data for 12 months. The color of each of those represents the temperature change for each month and year. So she, took a look at some data and created a quilt to reflect that data. And then the San Francisco air quality quilt. She does live in California, so you're doing things that too. You're doing local kinds of issues as well. This chronicles the city's air quality during the fires that raged for weeks in the San Francisco area. And what's interesting is she used screenshots captured on purpleair.com, which monitors the outdoor air quality. And so she took screenshots and then she created those blocks to talk about San Francisco air quality. So you might not know that these are about climate change or temperatures or air quality until you maybe read the title of the quilt and then maybe look at the artist statement as well. So the message is not so overt here, it's more subtle. These two quilts are about the melting ice is about climate change. The second one is about ocean pollution. And I remember seeing this at the Modern Quilt Go when I went to the show there. And so let's talk about melting ice. It was photographed melting icebergs in the Antarctica. And the artist submit says only one piece of solid white ice remains. The lighter pieces represent the melting ice with linear lines, darker pieces with curved quilting represents the surrounding. At the edge is all about standing at the edge of the ocean, wondering if we will ever get clean oceans again. Will the plastic washing ashore ever end? So you don't really know that, I don't think, until you actually read the artist's statement. Okay. This is very diverse in nature. These are Kathy Nidus quilts, You Pollute Me and Damaging Earth's Fabrics. You Pollute Me has, again, a lot of details in each quilt. You really have to step forward and study it. It's about, You Pollute Me is about energy, water pollution, toxic chemicals, all kinds of issues that are leading to climate change. She includes some positivity in there in what we have been doing, like windmills and recycling, but her point is that the negatives are overriding the positives. And then Damaging Earth's Fabric is a really interesting political quilt because it encompassed the broader concept of water pollution and landfills and recycling, but this also relates to textiles, which we use in making quilts, and how that damages the earth. Okay, A Sense of Whimsy and Humor with Linda McDonald. Though these are not titled, even the old growth must work for its keep, Wildlife Sanctuary and Tree Park. The tourist attraction where you can drive through the tree causes damage to the tree itself. The wildlife sanctuary is habitat destruction. So as more people populate those areas, they have to move into unfamiliar areas. So I like the look of bewilderment on the the animals, like where do we go from here? We're like boxed in. And then the last one is called Tree Park, which kind of paradoxical. You don't really need to think about it. It's a tree park and there's one tree standing. So she does use a sense of whimsy and a little bit of humor in hers, which I think is an interesting perspective for political quilts. And then I've only got a couple more and then we're going to talk about power. Toxic Chemicals and Endangered Species. This is Lana Rubin, Rocky Mountain Poison, and the other one is Compagri Fertility. So as you, and maybe some of you have seen these quilts, as you move closer to Rocky Mountain Poison, you see a lot more details. This is about the gold mine spill into the Animas River through Durango, Colorado. But it looks like a beautiful landscape from afar. And then you move closer to see there's skulls in the water and the water's moving from blue to red, right? Toxicity. Embroidered in there are names of Native American tribes and toxic chemicals that were affected by this. And then the second one is about endangered species. So you'll notice that the moth, there's realistic colors on the right side, and as you move, it moves to like these fantasy colors, meaning that as the plants that these butterflies are dependent on are diminishing, and so they're becoming an endangered species. And so what happens, right, is this, she uses the color to format that things are changing for them. And this is the last quilt, Sacred Tree. It's about, it was made in Birmingham, Alabama. It's a nonprofit organization that asks kids to create something about environmental justice. Okay, so that's kind of the ends of the quilts. I put this slide up here because meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? So Bruce Springsteen. So I'm going to show you another quilt. You can see all these kinds of different political concepts. But here's a quilt, the Women in Struggle quilt, which was made in the 80s. And it includes a lot of the topics that women are still quilting about. So all of those that I mentioned, right? Children and patriarchy. So one of the questions is, how much power do we have, right? If we're still quilting about the same issues, are they stagnant? Are they evolving, right? As time goes on. But this is a really fabulous quilt to think about. This was a globalized quilt, right? A global quilt that shows all kinds of issues across the world about what women are struggling with. So it's kind of interesting to think about, we're still doing some of the same topics that we have in the first. So here's my findings and analysis that women do still quilt about current, evolving, and past political issues. Circumstances, various circumstances, right? And emotions drive activist quilters. There's impact, there's a deeper impact, I think, on the personal, but it has the ability to reach the collective, meaning the controversy, right? That people can be angry about the issues, but it also builds a community for people who feel the same or have experienced the same topic that's depicted in the quilt. Power is defined differently for each, and it doesn't really align with political science definitions of power. It does have nuances of soft power, and it parallels transformative power. So here's some power concepts that the quilters have enlightened me on. There's power in the process. This is the majority of quilters that I interviewed. They all talked about the process of creating as being meditative, emotional releases, right? Healing, the power of producing things, researching the issues, building a consensus, working with experts in the area, maybe raising money for a cause is all very much about self-power. Making a quilt for an exhibition, being commissioned to create a quilt on something, and then acceptance into prestigious shows or exhibitions is a very self-powering kind of thing to create activist quilts. But it also reaches the collective, and many people talked about making a difference in someone's life, giving somebody a memory. The tagged quilt is really referenced here because somebody found their relative in that quilt and it gave them a memory. People weeping in front of their quilts is certainly an emotional reaction. It has caused political discourse, right? Whether you agree or not agree with that message, conversations have ensued. Building a community, raising money for a cause. So some of these are both self-power and collective power. But also if people are viewing political quilts and then they share them with others, right? And so people who are unfamiliar with political quilts and they see some, and sharing that is a very powerful concept. So this power and success was brought up throughout the entire study, that I asked quilters, what's a powerful or successful quilt? This is Luana Rubens, but several quilters mentioned the same kind of thing. We call it the method of discovery. So if their quilt, if you're walking and you see a quilt from across the room, and you're like, wow, that's really cool. Why is that? Why is those words on there? What does this picture mean? And you walk over to it. And then you view it closer to see all the distinctive features or to understand the message. So if that quilt keeps somebody a little bit longer, quilters say that is a successful quilt. I have got somebody's attention, right? And drew them in. I will say that measuring the success or power of a quilt is difficult. If they witness emotional reactions, right, and the method of discovery, that's certainly an indication that it's been successful. But also they talked about receiving emails and comments, how many eyes are on their quilt, how many people seen that quilt at the exhibition, if their quilt travels, right? If it's acquired by museums, it's deemed successful. If they've been invited speakers or commissioned to do specific quilts for topics, if your lectures are sponsored, if they use quilts in different ways, like some people have let their quilts be used as posters or on websites. Sales of quilts and patterns and raising money for a cause is also some measures of success. And the conclusions here for myself is that activist quilters are powerful in ways that I had not imagined. Because as a political scientist, I'm thinking, Are you changing policy? Are you making a representative or senator change their vote by viewing their quilt? But it's not really about that. It's transformative power. And the ability to elicit both positive and negative, very strong emotional reactions, because every quilter talked about it, that's powerful, right? If your quilt has a message and it elicits both positive and negative emotional reactions, that really speaks to how powerful your quilt is. It really got to somebody, whether it's negative or positive. The conscience of society, whether you're environmentalist, activist, the civil rights, or any other issue, your voice should be heard. And if you can't say it, you put it in a quilt. That's still a powerful statement. It's a gentler way to be civically engaged. Some people refer to themselves as subversive activists. So I think that's a very powerful kind of statement. And in closing, because I know I have to leave time for questions, a quote from Luana Rubin, when folks tell her you shouldn't do that, it's so political, her response is, it's not political, it's ethical and it's moral. So.
Thank you, Teri. Wow, this has been such an interesting discussion, and we've had so many great responses. And I love that people have given us their kind of visceral reaction to the quilt as we went through. Before we stop screen sharing, Teri, we talked a lot about the connection between political science and the quilt world, and we had a couple more slides that we thought kind of talked about how we could work together and benefit from each other. So would you like to talk a little bit more about these next slides we've got?
Yeah, that would be fine. I didn't
questions?
Okay, here we go. Should I just kind of like go through the slides?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to turn my audio off because there's something buzzing behind me that's loud. Okay, so go ahead.
No worries. I got like 3 more slides. Okay, so political science and quilt studies, how can we benefit from each other, right? Because this is the aspect that I really wanted to talk about as well, because now you've got expertise from 2 very different areas, and the more people you have on board about their expertise and contributing to it, it really opens up the doors to a wider audience and a greater understanding. So for us, right, it can help develop a nuanced understanding of quilts as political communication, persuasion, and educational opportunities, right? It certainly explores the creativity as your First Amendment right, so for us, it's allowing for a deeper understanding of the notion of power. Because I don't think political science concentrates on that, right? We talk about hard power and soft power and, influencing policy, but this is a very nuanced kind of power, and that transformative power. It opens the doors too for conversations about different aspects of quilts, but also from different disciplines. Because I know a lot has been from, when we look at quilt studies, a majority have been from history and art and stuff. And so adding that political science perspective, I think, is beneficial. We've been married a long time, politics and quilts. And so understanding these dynamics is going to understand the power of the quilts, but also the motivation and intent, right? Because it's very different for, I think, activist quilters versus traditional quilters about motivation and intent of a quilt. So what can we contribute? Perhaps different methodologies, a unique dimension to quilt research, because the whole point is to communicate a message or to make a statement about something. But an understanding, and I have on here First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the right to petition the government. These are called negative rights. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but a negative right is something that the government can't do. So if you read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law abridging right, freedom of speech. That's considered a negative right. All the activist cultures that I talked to all mentioned First Amendment rights, at least a majority of them. But we can think about the role of communities. So different communities that are experiencing different kinds of political issues within their community. And so how to engage these quilts as a substantive tool. And then what can we get, right? So what does quilt scholarship add to political science? And I just think that it's a unique approach that we have not considered. So it adds to our dimension of, how do we communicate? And if you don't want to stand on a street corner and protest, right, but you want to do something, you put it in a quilt. It's still civic engagement. It is political behavior. You're getting your message out there. It's expressive rights. And this research focuses on women's concerns, right? There are men who quilt and all kinds of stuff, but I just decided to, especially when I looked at the 1983-84 quilt about what was political issues in the 80s, and we're still quilting about them. Though some have evolved, we still quilt about them, right? Because it's still happening in whatever kind of groups you have. So I hope that answered your questions.
Well, thanks, Teri. We've had some really great comments and some questions, and so I'm going to read a few of these. Mostly it's about kind of the impact of the quilt and what kind of attention they gather and whether they're really making a difference. And somebody did comment that the artist Nancy Crow said she did not think quilts really made an impact and that they really changed anything. And this person, Paula, mentioned even Picasso's Guernica, the famous painting of war, and did that really stop wars from happening? Did any of the artists that you spoke to talk about that impact and what they were and how they felt the quilts were successful? I know you touched on that already, but maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think any of them are saying that they are going to change a politician's mind on a direct vote. But what they do emphasize is that it's getting the issue out there to educate people and to inform people of the decision. So power is really, it's hard to measure a successful or powerful quilt, but if you concentrate on the transformative notion of power and soft power, which basically means influencing people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a political issue. There was a story from one of the quilters some young students took a climate change quilt to a climate change protest, and they emailed her and said, "We just got back and there was nothing that happened." And she's like, well, it's not going to make a drastic change, right? Change happens conversation by conversation, but it might have sparked an issue or it might have sparked a thought. And that in itself is powerful. You might not change policy overnight, but how many people are, quilts is just one aspect. If people are quilting about climate change and people are protesting about climate change and using those quilts, it can be more powerful, I think. But also I think building relationships with, a lot of folks mentioned building relationships with researchers and interest groups, and interest groups are powerful. We live in a pluralist society. And so that means interest groups are vying for that. So if you're commissioned by an interest group to create a quilt for their website or for them to use in some kind of conference, that is very powerful for them and for that interest group, because then we'll get exposure to that. I just think it's not recognized. Some people talked about it's a woman's work, and so we get ignored. And so it's just time to bring it out into the light.
Well, that kind of brings up another question that we had. Louise said, "I'm interested in why people make quilts instead of painting, performance, etc." Do you feel a quilt attracts attention more than a traditional fine art?
Okay, so I did ask. So there are couple people that I interviewed who use different mediums. And I'm like, why do you use quilts versus different mediums? Because quilts are a source, typically when you think of a quilt, a source of comfort, and it's tactile and it's soft and you can touch it. And sometimes whether you're comforted by a scenery of nature or the double wedding ring or whatever traditional quilt, people can be comforted because they share that story in a quilt. It's very it's tactile and it's comforting to have a quilt. Not that they're going to, well, Darcy Reed wrapped herself in a quilt and it made her feel great, right? And so some people mention that they use the quilt because it's different, it's soft, it's tactile, you can touch it, it's warm. You could wrap in it if you wanted to. You could use it in a protest. So maybe that's, I don't know. We'd have to ask.
Now, I agree. I think that there is something about the contrast of that hard message or hard power maybe in the message, as you've been talking about, versus the soft power of a quilt. And sometimes I think that contrast does draw attention in a way that maybe other art forms may not. We had another question about just the topics that you saw. Did you find anything? This person said, this is Jane, who says, did you find quilts about defensive patriarchy, pro-fossil fuels, white supremacy, or other viewpoints opposing those that you presented?
Well, I'm trying to think. I did not see like pro-fossil fuels at all. And maybe they're there, I just didn't find them. I looked at, like I said, the databases of the Modern Quilt Guild. I looked at International Quilt Museum's database, and then I tried to find some of my own. Some people were not in there. So I found about 80 quilts, but a lot of them I had to narrow it. This study can be expanded for many years because there's a lot of issues. I mean, you could do a whole thing on patriotic quilts, right? And just patriotism. This, I wanted to do more of an activist kind of quilt where they're talking about issues that are oftentimes controversial. I'm sure they're out there. I did off the top of my head, I just can't remember, but I know there was no pro-fossil fuels or anything like that.
So another question from Jan. Contemporary artists and other media are making similar visual critiques of political, social, and environmental issues that speak to them. Are you aware of examples of textile art being recognized within the larger art world? Do you find what kind of inroads are being created more broadly?
So unfortunately, I'm not an artist, so I'm not in the art world. I just can't answer that question. I'm a political scientist, so I'm really looking at First Amendment rights and political communication, but I'm not familiar with the art world in general.
Yeah, and I could add a comment to that. I do think that we are seeing artists and quilts being embraced by galleries, going into other museums, other collections. So I think it's definitely happening. We're making inroads into the fine arts, but I think it's a slow process. But I think it's something that is being recognized, and it's an exciting new development in the quilt world.
Yeah, and can I make a quick comment? So the Modern Quilt Guild Best to Show quilt, I did not show, but it was a political quilt, which I think is like one of the first of best in show. I'm not sure, don't quote me on it, but it was recognized this year at Modern Quilt Guild. So political quilt.
Yeah,
so
Virginia.
That speaks to that, right? That the quilts are powerful and they're getting to people.
Yeah, Virginia Robinson's piece called School Supplies was a really amazing piece. And I think you might be right that it's the first best of show, even though there has been a really strong vein of activist quilts in the Modern Guild. I think that might be the first best of show. And it was really impactful, really impactful.
Yeah, it was a two-sided quilt. It was very sad, but very powerful.
Yeah, and we had one more question. We're getting close to time here that about the fact that, and I'm trying to find it here. I'm sorry, I'm flipping through here. Just about the fact, and I do think you touched on this, that people were talking about where we get our fabrics. Here we go. Shelby asked, I'm interested in where we get our fabric. Obviously, many environmental quilters are using materials that would otherwise go to the landfill. Did any of these quilters mention how they practice political activism during the during the acquisition of their fabrics? So were they being activist in how they found their fabrics?
Yeah, so I had a couple people say they only use recycled fabric. So I want to say Lorraine Woodruff only uses like her jeans and her family's clothing. So they're recycling their fabrics, or a lot of people are going to Goodwill, right, and getting clothing and then cutting it up and using it in their fabrics. So yeah, there were several people. In fact, they've suggested that there should be a category of recycled fabric quilts for shows. So yeah, some people are really committed, right, to the issue of recycling and reusing, and so yeah, several people did do that.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point because we know that the method of construction or creating fabric can be really harmful to the environment. So I'm happy to see that a lot of people are choosing other ways to find fabrics. Yep. So I've got one more question, and I think we're going to have to wrap up, darn it. But this was so interesting to me. Beth says, I'm fascinated that people run away from the term political. To my mind, just about everything in public is political. Politics is how things get done. What is the political science take on this phenomenon of avoiding political? That's a big question.
It is a big question. And so I'm going to come at it from a perspective of teaching. I will ask my students if they talk about politics, and a majority of them say no, because they don't like arguing. And I said, but politics is all about arguments. It's not, let's all get along, because that would be a really weird world if we all just agreed on everything all the time. I say we need different perspectives on whatever issue it is, right? And so to run away from politics gets nothing done. Like if you want something to change, you're going to have to talk about it. And that means arguing. And so people avoid it because of arguments. But that's what politics is about. Politics is all psychology and decision making and arguments. And that is life. That's what I tell my students.
I love that, Teri. Thank you. We had a couple of questions just about how people can get their quilts seen if they're making activist quilts, and that's a tough call. But I would recommend the Studio Art Quilt Associates has lots and lots of opportunities for people to exhibit quilts, and I think that's what you have to do is you just have to keep trying to get your quilts out there into different exhibitions. Maybe create an exhibition of your own group that you can get out to different organizations. So I do think, and SACWA's got great resources for artists. So if you're trying to find a way to get your art out there, I think that you'll find a lot of great opportunities on that site. So
a lot of the student people too were like posting on social media, getting attention that way. So that might be some opportunities for them to go as well.
That's a great idea. Well, gosh, Teri, it's almost the top of the hour, and we've had a couple more interesting questions, but we're just not going to have time. But Lucy did post your email address in the chat. So anyone who wants to contact Teri directly, please go ahead and do that. Teri, I had to cut Teri's slides down a lot. She had so much more great information that she gained from the interviews she did with all of the different artists. So I would encourage you to get in touch with Teri if you'd like to learn more about her research and the great job she's done on that. Teri, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a blast. I could talk for several hours, so.
It has been great, and it's been great to have you. So everybody, don't forget, next week will be a great discussion for the celebration of Juneteenth, so do join us again next time. And thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Teri. We'll see you soon.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.